Shalom, friends. We're so happy you're here with us today. Thank you for joining us for another great session with one of our master teachers, Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller. We're so thrilled to be partnering with our great partner, Beth El. In a moment, I'll turn it over to Wendy to offer words of introduction. Our topic today, as you know, is sovereignty, violence, and morality, Zionism and the ethics of Judaism. And I want to both support and challenge our learners today in that we are in war. When I say we, I mean, on the one hand, Jews are a part of that, but Israel is at war, and this is a very intense time, and we all have many viewpoints on that, on the relationship to Gentiles right now, the relationship to Gaza, the relationship to Israelis on the left, on the right, and everything in between, the relationship to the Israeli government. And this is a space of critical learning, pluralistic space of many viewpoints, and a space where we ask hard questions. It's not a space of prayer where we want people to be comfortable. It's a space of productive discomfort where we want to challenge each other to be a little uncomfortable sometimes in asking big questions and struggling with big problems and issues. And one of the best educators I know for that is Rabbi Chaim, who is someone who is rooted in the sources and knows how to challenge us to ask big questions. So I'm thrilled he's here. I'm thrilled you're all here to support each other and to challenge each other as we think through one of the very important issues of our time. With that, I turn it over to my friend and colleague, Wendy Raz of Beth El, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Reb Shmuley. It's such an honor to be sponsoring this event with Valley Beit Midrash, who gives us such great learning opportunities here and everywhere. I'm so happy to introduce Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller. He is a faculty member at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. He recently celebrated 40 years working with students and faculty as the executive director of the Yitzhak Rabin Hillel Center for Jewish Life at UCLA, where he is now director emeritus. Chaim was ordained at Yeshiva University, where he completed a master's in rabbinic literature. He has been a lecturer in the departments of sociology and Near Eastern languages and cultures at UCLA, and in the Department of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University. He's a faculty member of the Wexner Heritage Foundation, and he was a founding director of the Hartman Fellowship for Hillel Professionals and a founding member of Americans for Peace Now. Interesting also, Chaim was the rabbinic consultant to Barbra Streisand during the making of the film Yentl. He and his wife, Dr. Doreen Seidler-Feller, a clinical psychologist, are the parents of 2 children. Reb Chaim, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Reb Shmuley, and thank you, friends. And we have a lot to do, so this is going to be a very sort of pressured, quick ride through a lot of material, and I hope that I can make some points along the way that'll raise questions. I actually, given Reb Shmuley's introduction, I think I have to live up to it and generate some sort of tension here. That seems to be the task at hand. But what I wanted to say is that we're at a crisis point, and crisis points always afford an opportunity. Right? We can go in a number of directions. But the one thing that I think that we need to do is a self-examination, and it gives us an opportunity to rethink certain fundamentals about what we have rethink some of our assumptions. And I'm going to move through that today, so we'll see what the tradition has to say and where I want to go. My goal is to try to construct an inclusive and humanistic liberal Zionism that draws inspiration from the sources of Judaism. One of my assumptions now is that the legitimacy of Zionism, I think you'll all agree to this, is being challenged. It's being denigrated, Zionism, it's defamed, it's denounced. Most people don't know what it is, actually. And it's a challenge for us. How to liberate Zionism, face ourselves, face our students, and the world with a renewed sense of pride and confidence, if that's possible. We need to think about developing a new educational agenda. So the crisis has introduced a new situation. We can no longer have the luxury, it seems to me, of simply studying and considering many opinions. It's not an issue of pluralism. I think the time has come for us. We have to make some decisions and understand where we're going to go and choose what the path is that we're going to follow if we're going to resurrect what I would call a Zionism of values and reject a Zionism of power. It's no longer sufficient to merely suggest that there are multiple possibilities, which I will do. I'm going to go through the sources and show you that, but I'm going to move in a particular direction. We are going to focus on texts, on a variety of texts. I want to say a word about studying text. Number one, study itself of the text can be inspiring and uplifting. But what we really need to know is that texts can also be explosive. This is part of our tradition. Our tradition, like all traditions, includes negative teachings, what I tend to call texts of terror. So let me say a word about that because it will figure in the direction that we're going. And this is something that I learned from an important theologian, Christopher Stendhal, some years ago. He said the following, we were on a panel together. He was the dean of the Harvard Divinity School, and we were at the Hartman Institute. And he said that when he teaches his students, divinity students who are studying for the ministry, and they come across passages in the New Testament that are part of the regular reading cycle, and those passages are anti-Jewish, so he tells them the following. You are obligated, number one, to identify and acknowledge these are anti-Jewish passages. Number two, you must contextualize, meaning you have to tell your congregants that these passages were written in the first century, they refer to Jews in the first century, and they refer to an internal conflict within the Jewish community of that time and not to Jews living today. Number three, if you can, you should struggle to reinterpret those texts. And that's an important dimension of how we can assess how religion is functioning. Is it a vehicle for moving people in a positive direction, or does it focus on the negative? If it can reinterpret the text positively, it's moving in a direction of inclusivity. And if it's impossible to reinterpret, he says, then sometimes you have to condemn the text. Now, that's the most difficult thing. He didn't turn to me and say, so Chaim, that's what you have to do, but I understood that. If I'm doing this as a Christian, then we are obligated to do that as well. And we have plenty of texts that we need to struggle with in our own tradition, and teachings that we see that are floating around in our community. Even especially today, a poster that I have in my collection of posters and brochures on the history of Israel from the late 19th century to the present day. This poster was issued on May 14th, 1948 in the afternoon after Ben-Gurion had read the Declaration of Independence. And we'll see on the bottom of the next page, last paragraph, we have been cast into a cruel war. So Ben-Gurion wrote this text. He said, the Arab nations are lining up to fight against us, right? And we have to be ready for sacrifice. He's calling the country to war. And then he says, in the last paragraph, we have been cast into a cruel war. However, remember, within the confines of our state, citizens of the Arab people continue to live. For most of them, this war is repugnant. Their rights as equal citizens, we are commanded to uphold. We look to peace. Our hands are extended to them as partners in building the homeland. Now, I used to have an alarm system in our house, and when the alarm was set and all the windows was closed, so the panel read as follows. It said, Shalom, ready to arm. And that's how I understand this poster that Ben-Gurion released. Ready to arm, we're ready to fight. But at the same time that we're ready to fight, we preserve our commitment to peace and extending a hand to our neighbors and building an ideal society. That's the struggle. Is it possible to, at the same time, hold on to our nationalist aspirations and at the same time have a sense of inclusivity that allows us to move beyond our own noses? and understand that we have obligations to others, and we have to create an opportunity for us to live, to achieve coexistence, and not only be concerned with our own survival. That's the tension. And Ben-Gurion expresses it, it seems to me, very succinctly in this release, in this declaration. Similar, by the way, to the Declaration of Independence, which I'm going to read to you just a paragraph that I think you will know, but we should know this by heart already. The state of, you don't have this, so you don't have this in the printed sources. The state of Israel will promote the development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants, will be based on precepts of liberty, justice, and peace taught by the Hebrew prophets, will uphold the full social and political equality of all its citizens without distinction of race, creed, or sex, will guarantee full freedom of conscience, worship, education, and culture, will safeguard the sanctity and inviolability of shrines and holy places of all regions, and will dedicate itself to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Now, I know that a lot of these documents, they're aspirational and they seem to be exaggerated in terms of what they are looking towards, but it seems to me at this time, we have to hold this poster and this declaration, this paragraph in the Declaration of Independence as a standard by which we judge ourselves. How are we doing with our project called Zionism? How are we doing with the state of Israel in living up to the ideals and standards that we have set for ourselves? This is not what the anti-Semites are saying about us. This is what we say we need to achieve, to live according to the ideals of the Hebrew prophets. Are we doing that? Are we trying to do that? So that's where I want to go in terms of our understanding. So let us begin. I want to introduce us to an episode of violence in the Torah that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, Genesis 34, the rape of Dinah, and the reaction of Jacob and the response of the brothers. So what happens is Dinah is raped. Her brothers, the sons of Jacob, issue an ultimatum to the inhabitants of Shechem and to Hamor, the rapist, that the inhabitants of the city need to circumcise. Shechem and Hamor had said, "Come and marry with us and live among us. We'll create a joint society." The sons of Jacob said, "Okay, but you got to circumcise first." On the third day, after they had been circumcised, when they were weakest, Shimon and Levi, two sons, invade the city, kill all its inhabitants, destroy everything. And then their brothers come and take all the booty, and Dinah is saved. Of course, there are lots of problems with this, which you don't have time to get into. But at the end of the passage in 34, Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me, making me odious among the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites and the Perizzites. My men are few in number, so that if they unite against me and attack me, I and my house will be destroyed." So this is a utilitarian response. In other words, the ethics of Jacob's response is, you have hurt us in our effort to be integrated into the Canaanite society. We're no longer invisible. You've made us an object of their wrath because of your violence. But it's a very pragmatic response. You don't see the ultimate condemnation of the act itself. If we were not such a small in number, and if we weren't strangers in the land, then I would have approved of this, it seems he's saying. And the brothers respond, "Should our sister be treated like a whore?" It's a sense of pride. We have to preserve the dignity of our community. This is an act, our act was an act of deterrence and a preservation of our sense of a people with integrity, with some integrity. And towards the end of Jacob's life, so he has had time to reflect on what's happened, and he blesses his children. And among the blessings, we read the following. Not much of a blessing, as he refers to Shimon and Levi, to these two sons who are terrorists, basically. And he says to them the following: "Simeon and Levi are a pair. Their weapons are tools of lawlessness. Let not my person be included in their council. Let not my being be counted in their assembly. For when angry, they slay men, and when pleased, they maim oxen. Cursed be their anger so fierce, and their wrath so relentless. I will divide them in Jacob, scatter them in Israel." So at the end of his life, Jacob, having reflected on this act, is no longer simply criticizing them in a practical manner. He's essentially criticizing their behavior as unethical, as an act of violence, as an act of bringing shame upon the family, upon Israel, and they need to be rejected. They've lost their capacity to inherit territory in the land. In a way, they're being sort of banished from the collective of being possessors of the promised land, because they forfeited it by their act of violence. So this is a harsh judgment on their behavior. So we see the contrast between Jacob the younger and Jacob the elder. Was it his maturity? Is this a sort of a revision of his thinking? Are there two possibilities here that are raised? One, a pragmatic one, where the act of Shimon Levi is actually a precedent that can be utilized in future history. If, in other words, if we have the strength and if we're dominant, then sometimes an act of deterrence and terror might be necessary. Or is it a total rejection of this as not reflecting the values of Judaism? And any act of terror itself undermines our credibility as a Jewish people, as a people of values. All right, so that's what the biblical text sets up before us. Let's move, because again, we have to move through this. I wanted you to see, we're not going to read it, but I wanted you to know that Chernyakhovsky, the great poet, he along with Bloc, they were the founding poets of the renewed state of the emerging state of Israel. Chernyakhovsky was himself allied with a power-oriented the revisionists, and he turns around Jacob's curse to praise. So we see how the biblical text, I said it's explosive, the biblical text can be utilized in multiple directions. And Chernyakhovsky creatively takes advantage of the text to be able to claim that Shimon and Levi are actually nobility. Their weapons are holy in a way, even though Chernyakhovsky was not a religious personality, but he sees them as performing an act, a national act for the sake of the people, and they need to be lauded. Shaul, now in 1953, there was an episode where Ariel Sharon led a band of his soldiers, Unit 101, it seems to me, in a response to a terror act of infiltration of Jordanian Palestinians who killed I think a mother and a son, or a father and a son, and the Israeli army decided to respond, and there was an attack on the town of Kibbutz, and 69 people were killed, 45 of whom were innocent, 40 homes were destroyed, and this created enormous controversy within the nascent state of Israel. And there were various responses. One response was a rabbinic response by Shaul Yisraeli, who writes the following: "If so, we have learned from here that there is a particular concept of war of revenge." All right? I don't know whether when we learned in yeshiva, we heard about this, that there's we learned about a commanded war, an obligatory war, but a war of revenge, meaning a war of nikama, that in fact is obligatory. And this is a war against those who attack Israel. And such a war has specific regulations. What are those regulations? All the rules of war apply, and there is no obligation to be precise in carrying out the operation to cause harm only to those who took part in it. For this is the nature of war, that the righteous perish alongside the wicked. The conclusion of all this is that there is a place for revenge operations against those who attack Israel, and such activity falls under the category of an obligatory religious war. Such is the opinion of Shaul Yisraeli, and you'll find this in writings of certain right-wing rabbis to this very day, and of people who hold among the settlers, not all, but among the settlers, you'll find this opinion. There are no innocents. This is a war. All are objects of our activity, and so on and so forth. And you hear this type of language, by the way, coming from both sides. But Shaul Yisraeli was not the only voice. There was the voice of Isaiah Leibovitz. I suggest that you read the next text. We're not going to be able to read it. Let me summarize it. So what Leibovitz says is, we have a state now. The state is a test. Does Judaism really work? When we were in exile for 2,000 years, we developed a morality and a sensitivity to the stranger. and we grew as a community with an ethics of consideration for the other. Now that we have power, now that we have our own state, can we apply those standards that we nurtured and cultivated over 2,000 years in our new state of Israel? And those standards need to be applied when we confront a moral dilemma that we have now. There's no longer a question, says Leibovich, between good and evil, good and bad. The question facing us, that's a simple issue. If it were only a question between good and bad, then we know that we have to choose the good. The question now is between two possibilities. One is the state's interest in deterrence, and therefore it may be necessary, not a question of good, necessary to respond and to be vengeful. And there are the ethics of the tradition. What do we choose? How do we behave? What do we glorify? What's going to be our future? And how will we act? And will Judaism remain dominant in our thinking, or will the interests of the state become the dominant mode of thinking? So this is where we're left with Leibovich's essay, and we understand what his inclination is, because Leibovich is a critic of militarism and of the deterioration of values, of the values of Judaism in the emergent state of Israel. All right, so we're going to skip Gladstein. You'll read it on your own. You'll see what Gladstein says. Gladstein is a Yiddish poet, survived the war, writes about what we're losing. In other words, he's responding to this terrorist raid. The name of the town was Kibia. Maybe we could read just these last lines. Go scroll up a second. Let me scroll up, please. Okay, here. My dear enemy, my strong hand will also be just. Right? My strong hand will not just be violent. It will be just. The Yiddish word will not be desecrated. Gladstein, being a Yiddishist, says there was a culture that we had. That culture that we had was linked to the Yiddish language. Of course, we suffered, we were persecuted, but we developed a sense of dignity as a people, and we were true to our tradition in those years. The place where the peace stone will be laid will be rock solid and pure. And when we count all the dead, we will heal the mournful wounds with compassion, with faith, that even on the battlefield, in the shameful dark night, our sons must be Jews of light, not murderous aggressors, but defenders. Please scroll up for a second. Victors exalted. All right. So the Jews have to radiate light, even when they are in a position where they are struggling for their survival. We have an obligation to our tradition, to our hearts, to what's been bequeathed to us, to what we've developed as a way of life. The Midrash says, scrolling down for a second, Rabbi Elazar said, the sword and the book came down from heaven wrapped together. God said to Israel, if you will do what is written in this book, you will be saved from the sword. And if not, you will be slain by this sword. So this is going to appear, I'm going to show you this at least 2 or 3 times as we go through the sources, and you'll understand how this plays out. This is the question. The sword and the book came wrapped together. HaSefer, listen to the Hebrew. HaSefer, the book, the HaSayef, the sword, came wrapped together. The question is, do they live with one another? Does the sword dominate the book, or does the book dominate the sword? The Midrash seems to be inclined in the direction that if you're going to survive as Jews, then the book has to dominate the sword, because the book takes precedence over the sword. That's critical in terms of your survival and being true to to the Jewish people. Let's skip the next couple of sources, please. We'll skip the Talmudic passage. I'm sorry. You'll have to learn on your own. This is a little bit of background. Let's go forward, please, through the next page. The next page. And the next page, I'm sorry, everybody. So you have a lot of material. We're going to skip this one too. Teitelbaum, I'll tell you what that is. And we'll come to the following source 13. Okay. So Rabbi Teitelbaum was a Satmar Rebbe. He was an anti-Zionist. He clearly agreed that the book takes precedent, not only takes precedence, dominates, then should actually eradicate the sword. The book should make the sword completely disappear from our whole lexicon. And he holds to the position that the Jews have no political role to play as Jews, as a people. It's all in God's hands. All right, but I'm not going to get in. And he in the process he criticizes Zionism, and he says that Zionism was responsible for the Holocaust. I can't get into explaining the nature of the Satmar Rebbe, but let me say one thing, just as a sort of a redemptive side of teaching that I myself have maligned all my life, and I still am. It makes me very uncomfortable to read his writing because it's exaggerated, and I think that he was dissembling on certain matters, even though he was a great rabbi, etc. But what he does raise is the following: we are a people that was proud of its ethical tradition. And the fact is, he said, that any time you get involved with state business, you get involved with violence. What did we bring upon ourselves? What did we buy into? Were we aware of the fact that, did we know that no matter what our tradition was, when we engage in creating a modern nation state, we will behave like all modern nation states? It's inevitable. And that will do violence to our sacred tradition and to our character. Will we survive as Jews is really what he's asking about this. And that's why he has to back out from support for this effort of the state. Now, among the others who opposed the state of Israel was the Lubavitcher Rebbe of the time, Chabad. And you should know this, that even to this very day, Chabad is pro-Israel, but anti-Zionist, non-Zionist, let me put it that way. But Schneerson says it best. Shalom Ber, he wrote this in 1903, and he says as follows: he may then make an agreement with himself. All right, we'll skip this first sentence. But the Zionists are far more cunning than the secularists in their evil, and they have made nationalism a substitute for Torah and commandments. That's the criticism. Mandelstam, in his open letter, stated that a Jew was not one who fulfilled the commandments, but one who was a Zionist, even though he did not put on tefillin and did not keep the Sabbath, the period, etc., etc. So the critique of the Lubavitcher Rebbe is that Zionism, we oppose Zionism because it's attempting to replace Judaism with nationalism. Then that's a desecration. In fact, that is a form of idolatry. We reject God for the sake of worshiping the state. And he sees that as the end of the capacity for the Jews to function as a religious Jewish community, having embraced nationalism as their future. And that's the tension. Now, it wasn't only from religious sources that there was a critique of Zionism, also from a very important literary critic, George Steiner, a British Jew. I think we could say that Steiner is within the group of non to anti-Zionists. But a principle of mine is that we can't afford to reject these teachings out of hand simply because they're not Zionist. Meaning, as uncomfortable as I feel reading Schneerson, I have to say to myself, whoa, he has something to say. That's not altogether, wrong. Has nationalism replaced Judaism in the minds of many? Has it become the new religion of the Jewish people? That's a serious question. And we need to read the opposition in order to be able to raise serious questions, even when we disagree with the opposition. And we don't feel that they've exhausted the question completely, but they have a point to make. Same thing is true with Steiner. And let's scroll down, please. I want to go to the, if we can scroll down, please. This is a long essay that he wrote. Please, go back, please. Yeah, okay, these last few paragraphs. All right. So the name of the essay is Our Homeland, the Text. Steiner's point is that for 2,000 years we survived without a homeland. Why did we survive without a homeland? Because we had a homeland. The homeland was the text. We lived in the text. I want to remind people, what is the title? What's the Hebrew word for a title page? Anyone know? the Hebrew word for a title page. It's sha'ar. It's a gate, because it's the gateway into the text, and it's the gateway into the temple. So the temple was destroyed and we lost our sovereignty, but we were able to hold on to our identity because we had a text in which we were invested. And we lived fully Jewishly because we were able to carry that text. All the other nations of antiquity that had temples and sovereignty and were defeated, they ceased to be functioning cultures, contributing living cultures, because their basis was destroyed. We lost our sovereignty, but we continue to live. Now, people see that as a miracle, but the miracle was that we had transferred our loyalty from material construction and from power to the text, to the text and the values of our tradition. And those values are eternal. And that's what Steiner is trying to struggle with, because, I mean, he's a literary person. So he writes as follows. The state of Israel is an endeavor wholly understandable, in many aspects admirable, perhaps historically inescapable, to normalize the condition, the meaning of Judaism. It would make the Jew level with a common denominator of modern belonging. It is, at the same time, an attempt to eradicate the deeper truth of unhousedness, of an at-homeness in the word, which are the legacy of the prophets and of the keepers of the text. Let's go back. I skipped an important paragraph. Please go back a little bit. All right, stop right here. But there is a more central intimation. One need be neither a religious fundamentalist nor a mystic to believe that there is some exemplary meaning to the singularity of Judaic endurance, that there is some sense beyond contingent or demographic interest to the interlocking constancy of Jewish pain and of Jewish preservation. There must be some meaning to all our suffering. The notion that the appalling road of Jewish life and the ever-renewed miracle of survival should have as their end, as their justification, the setting up of a small nation state in the Middle East, crushed by military burdens, petty and even corrupt in its politics, shrill in its parochialism, is implausible. I cannot shake off the conviction, this is the ikar, this is the essence, that the torment and the mystery of resilience in Judaism exemplify and act an arduous truth, that human beings must learn to be each other's guests on this small planet, even as they must learn to be guests of being itself, of the natural world. This is a truth humbly immediate to our breath, to our skin, to the passing shadow we cast on a ground inconceivably more ancient than our visitation. And it is also a terribly abstract, morally and psychologically exigent truth. Man will have, or humans will have to learn it, or we will be made extinct in suicidal waste and violence. So I want to say that Steiner, without knowing it, or maybe knowing it, understands what we read in the Parsha a week ago. Kili haaretz, the land, the earth belongs to me. The basic lesson, religious lesson, overriding lesson, is that we are all guests. We are all strangers in God's earth. The consciousness of God as the creator should give us the ability to understand that all we do is possess. We don't own. No one is the Baal. No one is the master. The attempt to assert mastery is an attempt to dominate, and eventually not only to dominate the land, but to dominate people who live on the land. What Steiner is calling for is liberating ourselves from that natural tendency, that impulse that we have to be in control and understand that we all live together here in this world as strangers. What would it mean if we could achieve such a consciousness? How we would relate to one another? What would it mean in terms of being able to invite asylum seekers and understand they have a place among us? Our borders, what do borders mean? Borders are artificial. We live in a world that's all where we all should be able to share together. Of course, that's implausible, impractical, and we do have nations. But the point, of course, is as we work through these sources to understand that we should hold up Steiner as a critique, or as a critique of where we're going, and ask ourselves, how can we integrate the teachings of Steiner into our national enterprise? Is it possible, even though he was antagonistic to the very idea of a nation state, that since we have set up already the nation state, that we can integrate some of those notions and some of those values into our own policies? So that's the challenge. He also feels that, of course, that investing our energy in power and running a state is going to deplete our intellectual capital that we've developed over the centuries and our morals over the centuries. The response to Steiner, scroll down, please, is that of Ruth Calderon in the Knesset. We can't read it, you'll read it on your own, where Ruth Calderon was elected to the Knesset. She came up to the podium, a woman with a Talmud, and she taught a Talmudic lesson. And what she said was, the state of Israel gives us an opportunity. Steiner, you're wrong. It's not that the sword has triumphed over the book and that the book is defeated, but in this nation state, we have an opportunity to multiply study, to multiply commitment to learning, to increase the population's exposure to the traditions of Judaism. And in doing so, we will revive and renew Judaism in the process. So this is part of the argument. I have a lot of sympathy for Ruth's position, and she's created institutions in Israel that actually make this a possibility for Israelis who don't come from a religious background, who don't have the texts as their back, in their back pocket. But she exposed them to this learning, and they've been inspired to continue in this way. So this is the mode, Ruth Calderon's mode of renewal, the renewal that we need to initiate in advancing the ideas, the values of Zionism. Let's scroll down, please. So having seen the anti-Zionists, let's move now to a different position, to that position that extols nationalism and power. And the source is within the teachings of Jabotinsky, the founder of what was revisionist Zionism, a right-wing, what we would call a right-wing Zionist form that was nationalistic, is nationalistic. Bibi, in many ways, is a descendant, inherited the mantle, although he doesn't resemble Jabotinsky at all in any way. But it is in that vein that he operates. And what Jabotinsky wrote was as follows. Sometimes we base too many rosy hopes on the fallacy that a certain people has itself suffered much and will therefore feel the agony of another people and understand it, and its conscience will not allow it to inflict on the weaker people what had been earlier inflicted on it. All right? You're familiar with this? This sounds like Jews, right? How do Jews behave? Well, we told ourselves, since we suffered in Egypt, we should have compassion on others who are strangers and who suffer. And it's our obligation to do so. So what Jabotinsky says is nonsense. That sort of psychology is a psychology of self-defeat. In reality, it appears that these are merely pretty phrases. Only the Bible says, thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, seeing you as strangers in the land of Egypt. Contemporary morality has no place for such childish humanism. So what Jabotinsky says is, this notion that Jews are supposed to be super ethical, and that because we suffered, we have an obligation to others who suffer, is balderdash. No one in the world, no nation operates according to those principles. If a nation operated according to those principles, then it wouldn't survive. If we're going to survive, we have to be hard-nosed and understand that maintaining the childish morality of the Bible is self-defeating and needs to be rejected out of hand as something that will not allow us to progress in our effort and our endeavor to create a state for us, because we need the state in order for us to survive. Remember, Jabotinsky was running around Europe in the 20s and the teens of the 20th century telling people, you must leave. My father, alav shalom, was someone who was influenced and inspired by Jabotinsky as a young boy. And Jabotinsky, by the way, was a literary figure. It wasn't that he was only sword. He was a translator. He himself was a writer, right? He was an intellectual. So he tried to maintain the sword and the book, except that he said, now we need to raise the sword because we need to survive. And the book has to be in the background. Let's move on. Just a comment here on the next page. Jabotinsky writes a play about Samson. It's interesting to me that Jabotinsky wrote a play about Samson, and Achad Ha'am, whom we'll see in a moment, wrote an famous essay about Moses. Achad Ha'am wrote about Moses, the lawgiver, the ethicist, and Jabotinsky celebrated Samson, the heroic strongman. the only suggestion in the Bible of a Greek type hero who's actually a failure, a tragedy, as it appears in the Bible. But Jabotinsky holds out that image as something that's as motivating in this new endeavor to create a state. To the famous essay by Jabotinsky, The Iron Wall. Let's go to the next page, actually. We can't read all of this. Okay, that's the top of the page. Okay. We cannot offer, he's writing about the Palestinians. Now, one thing about Jabotinsky is he had a realistic assessment about the Palestinians. He said, don't, the labor Zionists, the Ben Gurion crowd, they think that through peaceful negotiations and conversations and they could make a deal and together with the British, they don't understand who they're facing. These people, they love their land. Their land is their patrimony. We need to recognize that, and we have to treat them with dignity and honesty. And dignity and honesty require that we have to oppose them with force, because they will not concede. Understand that. They have a sense of integrity. They know that this property belongs to their families, and they're not going to give it up. And the only way that we're going to be able to succeed in terms of, in our quest to achieve and to build a national home is if we dominate. So we cannot offer any adequate compensation. They're not going to take any compensation to the Palestinian Arabs in return for Palestine. The thing about Jabotinsky here is what he's trying to say is that you labor Zionists, you're hypocrites. Because what you're saying is you really want, you respect the Palestinians, right? You want to negotiate with them. You hope that there won't be any violence. Whereas in the back of your mind, you know that in the end, you're going to do the same thing that I'm going to do. So at least I'm honest in my assessment of who they really are. And I respect them because they are committed to their history and to their connection to the land itself. And therefore, there is no likelihood of any voluntary agreement being reached. So that all those who regard such an agreement as a condition sine qua non for Zionism may as well say none and withdraw from Zionism. Zionist colonization must either stop, interesting use of the word colonization, or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, meaning our power, behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach. All right, in the second place, right, these are excerpts. What is impossible is a voluntary agreement. As long as the Arabs feel that there is at least the least hope of getting rid of us, they will refuse to give up this hope in return for either kind words or for bread and butter, because they are not a rabble, but a living people. When a living people yields in matters of such vital character, it is only when there is no longer any hope of getting rid of us, because they can make no breach in the iron wall. Not till then will they drop their extremist leaders whose watchword is never. But the only way to obtain such an agreement is the iron wall, which is to say a strong power in Palestine that is not amenable to any Arab pressure. In other words, the only way to reach an agreement in the future is to abandon all idea of seeking an agreement at present. Power, violence, dominance, and then you make peace. When they understand that you're ruling, then you make peace and you include them. I mean, he had a role for the Arabs to play in the new government. The vice premier of every government would be an Arab. The premier, that was Jabotinsky's projection. Okay, now I want you to see one more text. Among these, just a paragraph. Skip down in this poem to the bottom of the next page. Okay, here we are. So right here. This is Uri Tzvi Greenberg, the poet of rage. He was the inspiration in the movement, in the revisionist movement, in Jabotinsky's movement. He was part of a small group that was called Brit HaBiryonim, the covenant of the brutes, of the thugs. But he was a masterful poet on the level of Bialik in terms of his importance for the developing Hebrew language in the emerging state of Israel. And he wrote as follows. Your rabbis taught there is one truth for the nations, blood for blood, but it is not a truth for Jews. So here is Greenberg really saying something so striking, so poignant, right? So sharp. What he says is that when we see the verse ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, we immediately recoil and we say, oh, no, vengeance. It couldn't be vengeance. And the rabbis in their moral teaching said, no vengeance, monetary compensation. So Greenberg says the same thing that Jabotinsky said. Childish childish, humanistic morality. You can't be a people and hold on to such a way of thinking. It is self-defeating. What do you want to do? Is crucify yourselves for the sake of holding on to your principles? Everybody in the world knows that an eye for an eye means vengeance. So until we grow up and until we know that an eye for an eye means what it says, then we're not going to succeed. The rabbis said there is one truth for the nations, which is vengeance, blood for blood. But it is not the truth for Jews because we're very moral. And I say there is one truth and not two. We are a nation like all other nations, and we're only going to grow and develop and be able to create what we need if we act like all the others. And there is one son, etc., etc. And he continues. So you understand the power of the force that is trying to inspire the yishuv, the settlement, to engage, to be armed, and to defend itself, and to be victorious. Let's move on, please. Let's see where this is going. So along with the teachings, we have to go through the next few sources quickly. Next page. Quickly. Chernichovsky again. And no, we'll skip this as well. Page 24. Stop. Okay. So now we move from revisionist Zionism, power-oriented, embrace of violence as a means to achieving our end, to the teachings of Rabbi Kook. Now, there are two Rabbi Kooks that are relevant here. Rabbi Kook the Elder, the first chief rabbi of Palestine, appointed in the 20s, who was a spiritualist, a mystic, a halachist, a Talmudist, and someone who had broad leanings and inclinations to be inclusive of all Jews and of all peoples. But he was a messianist, and he saw the land of Israel as essential. And he writes as follows: Eretz Yisrael is not something external to the Jewish people, a necessary framework of communal life, and a basis of material or even spiritual existence. Eretz Yisrael has an intrinsic value, vitally associated with the Jewish genius. Eretz Yisrael is ontologically holy. By definition, everything associated with it is purposeful. When we live there, it makes us holy, and it liberates us. It's the land that functions to elevate us. And he ends this paragraph by saying, only the hope generated by this land is capable of infusing life into Jewish existence. Thus, diaspora Judaism is a function of the prospect of salvation, whereas Jewish Eretz Yisrael denotes salvation itself. All right. So Rabbi Kook goes on to talk about here. Let's scroll down here, please, about the coming of the Messiah. But also, one of the things that seems to him to be an indicator that the time of the Messiah has arrived is the First World War. And he valorizes the war. This is very strange in terms of the teaching of Rabbi Kook. And he ends this paragraph by saying, Master of wars, he calls God, sower of righteousness, producer of salvations, creator of cures, awesome of praises, master of wonders, who renews with his greatness daily the act of creation. Let's shine a new light on Zion and let us all merit quickly to God's light, meaning the First World War has ushered in a new age. And the new age will be one of light for all. And the war itself has opened up a transition in human history. So he sees the war as a positive development. And he goes on to say as follows, that during Jewish history, what happened was we made a deal. God, move on to page 25, to the next page, please. We made a deal. The deal was that the nations of the world, they take care of politics. They do the violence, they do the military, they fight with one another. And we sit and we study and we develop our spiritual life. We are the godly people. When the Messiah comes, we will be able to re-embrace politics because that will be God's politics. No longer profane politics, no longer corrupt politics, but the politics of the divine. And you and I know where the politics of the divine can lead. They lead directly, let's move on, let's skip this next source. They lead directly to Rabbi Kook Jr., Rabbi Kook's son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda, who was not as great as his father. And in late May 1967, 3 weeks before the Six-Day War, he gives a speech in his yeshiva, in the yeshiva that his father had established, Merkaz Harav, and he says the following. He says, in 1948, I didn't go out into the street to dance when we were celebrating the creation of the state. How could I celebrate? Where was my Jerusalem? My Jerusalem. Where was my Hebron? Where was my Shechem? Where was my Jericho? We didn't conquer the land. We conquered the coastline. We left all of that. I couldn't bring my heart to celebrate because the holiness was absent. 3 weeks before the Six-Day War, then the war erupted, and Rabbi Yehuda Kook was considered a prophet because this sermon was considered to be sort of a prophetic inspiration for what occurred. God had heard him and opened up the possibility of warfare, which then produced the miraculous Six-Day War and victory. Let's scroll down to the top of the next page, and Rabbi Kook, Rabbi Yehuda ends this speech that he gives in the yeshiva. But the holiness of the Israel, this is before the victory. He says, but the holiness of Israeli army uniforms is inherent. The sanctity of every implement of the mitzvah in all its aspects. Every tank, the holiness of our tank that will appear tomorrow in the march. The sermon is a bit incoherent. I'm sorry about the lack of grammar here, but this is just a precise translation, that the mitzvah is to build the land of Israel, settle the land of Israel, building the land of Israel, which is to be done from the general principle. The building is to be done by the nation, the building of our government, our sovereignty by our hands, through all the implements related to this, and from this dwellings and the like. Our mitzvah is to be a fighting people. That's what I want you to hear. I don't know whether you ever heard that mitzvah before, but now you are initiated into the mitzvah of being a fighting people. The commandment to rule is a commandment to be a fighting people, whereas we are commanded to be a fighting people for a commanded war, increasing the Torah. That is, the warfare increases, expands the Torah itself. And the expansion, we already see it here, because Rabbi Kook, in his imagination, has told us the uniforms are holy, the tanks are holy, the guns are holy, the army is holy. Not only the land is holy, but all the government is holy, because it's all associated with the development and the fulfillment of this mitzvah of creating this national homeland. All right, we'll skip down the next Torah Eretz Yisrael. Skip down. We'll skip this. We don't have time. Just let's stop for a second. Sword, and here he extols the force of power, and he says as follows: sword and book came down intertwined from heaven for a sublime blessing and for eternal glory. For the people of the sword cannot be cut off from and free of the book, which is the might of our life and the strength of our life. Okay, while the people of the book cannot be cut off and exempt from the sword, it being a required part of the people's source of life and sanctity. And I would say that what Rabbi Kook understands is that there are times where the sword has to be dominant, and there are times where the book has to be dominant. Maybe he's saying that they have to act jointly. I don't know. In other words, maybe you have to find some way of harmonizing the sword and the book. But Rabbi Kook certainly gives license to the sword. And he, in some ways, reflects in a religious tone, in a messianic religious tone, because overarching these teachings is the sense that we're in messianic era, and that we have an obligation, a divine obligation, to fulfill God's promise by capturing the land, dominating the land, and sort of easing the way for the arrival of the Messiah. This figures in his writing and in the writings and teachings and actions of his students, the settlers, the Gush Emunim, the Bloc of the faithful who settled the West Bank. They, behind their thinking, is the teachings of Rabbi Yehuda. Yes, this is a poster in my collection. Please, let's go further. And at the top of the page, just so that you know what he wrote: this entire land is ours, absolutely ours, and none of it is to be handed over to others, for here there are no Arab territories and Arab lands, only Israelite lands. There's no thing. They live here, but the land is ours. It always was ours. The eternal heritage of our ancestors that others built on without our permission and our presence. And we never left the heritage of our ancestors. Scroll down, please, to the bottom of the page. The outcome of this teaching of Rav Kook is the following: this perverse and obscene teaching. The day will soon come. Rabbi Yisrael Hess was the chaplain at Bar Ilan University until he wrote this. The day will soon come when we will all be called to fulfill the mitzvah of this jihad, the mitzvah war, to annihilate Amalek. That is the mitzvah of genocide. The mitzvah of genocide. The manner of its implementation is detailed in 1 Samuel 15:3. Now go, attack Amalek, that is the Palestinians, and proscribe all that belongs to them. Spare no one, but kill alike men, women, infants, and sucklings, oxen and sheep, camels and asses. I need 5 more minutes. Let's scroll down to the next page, please. Okay, stop. All right, and I'm going to have to summarize in order to finish. So I want to bring you the humanistic slash religious tradition, as reflected in the teachings of Achad Ha'am, who had abandoned a traditional religiosity, but who was who emerged out of a household where he was immersed in the sources, and he became sort of the secular rabbi of Zionism and a profound ethicist. And Achad Ha'am visited Palestine in 1891. His name was Asher Ginsburg. He took the pen name "One of the People." That's a whole story what he meant by that name. And what he said was, I notice already now in 1891, it's only 9 years after the Aliyah of the Chovevei Tzion, the first Aliyah. And what he says is, I see how you treat the Arabs. You treat them with contempt. You treat them, you persecute them. This is a reflection of something that our Tanakh, that our sacred book has taught us in Proverbs. Eved ki yimloch. You have to beware of the slave that becomes a king. Beware, because when the slave becomes a king, the slave is going to avenge his suffering, because the slave is going to say, "You made me suffer. I'm going to do this to you." And Achad Ha'am says, that's how we're behaving. But I want you to know something. The Arabs don't forget. They may concede, they may lower their heads, but in the end, they'll not forget what you've done to them. So this was an early warning. Let's move on. Move on, please. So the ethical tradition is being pushed forward to the next page. Please, the next page. Stop. Okay. All right. Let's move on. Move on. I'll tell you. I recommend that you read the passage from At the Crossroads. We can't do it now. It's about the Balfour Declaration, and it'll blow your minds, because we don't really understand the Balfour Declaration. It didn't promise the Jewish people a state. It promised us a homeland, and it was very specific about that. And even though, I'm not arguing, I'm not against the state, but we have to be honest in terms of what we did, what was promised to us, and what our history is. Okay, but this is important. Achad Ha'am, there's a rumor in the community. It was borne out that an innocent Arab was killed by a Jew, and Achad Ha'am writes a letter to Haaretz, in which he says the following: for 2,000 years, we didn't shed blood. For 2,000 years, we watched as the nations of the world persecuted us, persecuted others, and fought with one another in mass battles in which there was large loss of life, and we maintained a real purity of arms, in which we were not involved. Is this where we have been led? Now that we're establishing our state, are we going to join the forces of bloodshed? In other words, are we going to embrace Uri Tzvi Greenberg's poem about blood for blood? Or do we still hold on an ideal that we seek coexistence and peaceful living with one another? Let's move. Let's move beyond Achad Ha'am to the teachings of Rabbi Reines. Okay, please, this next teaching, 37. Okay, please, come right here. Thank you. Okay, so Rabbi Reines was the founder of religious Zionism. So what you need to understand is that although the Cookian mode, the Cookian direction of religious Zionism is the mode that's dominant, the Cookian option, and those teachings have really they've become dominant, I think, in a greater part of the Jewish community. Nevertheless, the founders of religious Zionism had a very different outlook, and until the Six-Day War, the religious Zionists were basically moderates, and they had an understanding about the fact that we need to be able to achieve coexistence in this land. When I don't have time to go further, but you just have to see how they operated within the early governments as partners with Ben Gurion and with Levi Eshkol. It was only after 1967 that the Cookian mode of thinking emerged as the major way of thinking in religious Zionism, and it promoted this type of fundamentalist extremism. But the essential teaching of religious Zionism is reflected in Reines's teaching. Reines writes, the Beit Midrash is a manifest protest against wars and warriors, against instruments of destruction and weapons. The whole purpose and desire of such a house is to smash swords into pieces, to shatter spears and all other weapons into smithereens, to melt them down and use them to make pens. This is fantastic. In other words, if you understand what he's saying that the sword itself is going to be turned into a tool for writing the book. That's the goal. It's not that the sword and the book have to coexist. the book has to become a transformative force to be able to turn our minds in such a way that we understand that our teaching, our outlook is one where we're going to try to engage in a nationalist project that's different from all other nationalist projects, and attempt to achieve a mode of morality that reflects the values of our tradition. It's a struggle. He understands it as a struggle, but we need to preserve that sense of teaching that our obligation is to turn the swords into pens and creativity, with pens with which the scribes may write the fundamentals of Torah, and wisdom spread peace and make salvation bloom in the land. There is no greater blasphemy than to bring instruments of destruction into the house of Torah and wisdom. No greater blasphemy than turning our people into a militant people like all other nations. One more source, and then we'll conclude. Please scroll down to Moshe Avigdor Amiel. Stop here. Amiel was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, reflecting the old form of religious Zionism. He writes as follows: he understood. He was a student of history, and he himself had he emigrated from Antwerp to become the chief rabbi. He actually defeated Rabbi Soloveitchik in the 1935 election for chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, and he said the following: nationalism with a capital N is based on the materialistic view of the world, which sees in everything only the triumph of brute force, and justice belongs to the strongest. Therefore, the core of this nationalism relies on material toughness, on physical might, on an iron fist, on an iron wall. This nationalism, he's responding to Jabotinsky, this nationalism derives its nourishment first and foremost, not from God's image, that is man, but from the corruptive devil that dwells within, that is, from the hatred harbored toward anyone of a different race or nationality. He understands the evil that is a potential of nationalism. Nationalism of this kind derives from the ancient idolatry in which every nation had its particular idol. There was a god of Assyria and a god of Aram. All in all, Zionism has brought about a kind of Copernican revolution, the world of Judaism, that is to say, if in the past, to the world of Judaism. If in the past God and the Torah was central to all thoughts of Judaism, and we ourselves, the people of Israel, and all the more so the land of Israel, danced around that center, Zionism has reversed the situation. The land of Israel, has become the center of all centers. And on the other hand, even the Torah and God, as it were, have been demoted to the periphery. Please scroll down. He says, for the Israelite nation harbors the utmost hate for war, even defensive war, and if at times has no choice but to apply the undisputed halacha as ruled that if a person comes to kill you, kill him first, he does so with sorrow and regret. Such morals are the morals of not of Judaism, that is violence, that when we employ violence, but of the Gentile nations. Each nation, each people says that its existence is a supreme value, and that thou shalt not kill is merely one of the 10 commandments, and we're et cetera, et cetera. So he goes on and on. So I know that I have to come to a conclusion. So let me say the following. So what you see here in these religious teachings, and I need to further develop this, is the potential for reconstructing a connection to the land, albeit based on Judaic sources, that allow us to understand that our obligation is to try to reverse the tendency of nationalism and to use and to see the Judaic teachings as a counterforce to the impulses, to the natural impulses of humanity and of nations all around the world, and try to see our tradition as a control, not as that the tradition rejects nationalism, not that tradition rejects Zionism, but that tradition behaves as a control over Zionism, so that the excesses of nationalism are going to be limited and restrained, and that's the positive impact that our teachings, that our texts can have on our consciousness and our being and on our character, that we understand who we are as a people, and that we struggle to preserve that as we continue to preserve what we have created. Let me just say the following. It's clear to me that Zionism has been the most creative achievement of the Jewish people in the modern world. We can't allow Zionism to also become the most destructive element that has emerged in Jewish history. We have to revive it in a way that it lives in a positive way, that it inspires us to return to the values of Judaism. A final teaching. To quote Nachum Goldman, this was given to me by friend and teacher of blessed memory, Leonard Bierman. Nachum Goldman said the following. Nachum Goldman was the chair of the World Zionist Congress and of the World Jewish Congress, and was sort of the foreign minister for the Jewish people. He negotiated the reparations with the Germans, and he and Ben-Gurion had a very sort of interesting relationship. For 2,000 years, said Goldman, we Jews have lived without power, and without power, we form the noblest visions and highest ideals. Now we have power. In Israel, we have a flag, an army, an air force, and an intelligence apparatus, the envy of every nation in the region. And in America, we have wealth and status and political influence. Yes, we have power, but we have not yet learned to use that power in the service of our ideals. So it is that the Jewish people has never been more threatened than it is today. For what is threatened is the ethical core of our being, the ethos of the Jewish people. Let us all together work to reviving that ethical core and the ethos, the character of the Jewish people. Thank you. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you so much, Rav Chaim. It's always a pleasure to learn with you. I'm sorry we don't have time for questions today, but I also want to thank Beth El for co-sponsoring today's program, and thank you all so much for joining and for learning with us. Take care, everyone.
If anybody wants to send me an email, it's chaimsf@ucla.edu, and I may respond to you. But I mean, I'm sure that there are people with questions. chaimsf, chaimsf@ucla.edu. And I just had to get through this. I wanted you to see the full range of ideas. And we're not there yet. We're only on the, we're on the edge somehow. We have to rebuild. We need some new teachings, right? That's the point. And we have teachers. Let me say there's a group called Smol Emuni. I don't know if you're aware of this. The Faithful Left. And they're busy writing new Torah and new teachings from their perspective. Zionist teachings, lovers of the land, but lovers of the tradition and of its values. So you can go on the website, and most of it is in Hebrew. There are some writings that have been translated already and that are available online. So please, take care.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.